Hey everyone, it's Ed Gutowski. I am going to create a short lecture today that we're going to talk about the next phase of rhetoric and argument. We're going to talk about fallacies. So before you start this lecture, I think it's important you take our St. Martin's Handbook, and you might want to review pages 149 to 153, because those pages will tell us, give you a little bit of background to kind of an introduction to fallacies, and then you can come back to this lecture to get an understanding of what you read. So I've read you guys' comments about rhetoric and argument. They've been fantastic. Everyone has had a great definition of rhetoric. And notice the one link that most students like to use when defining rhetoric is they like to use the term persuade. So I'm still going to maintain my definition of rhetoric, and I'm still going to define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and con people. We now know that rhetoric and argument use three things: logos, pathos, ethos, which is logic, emotion, and character and authority. But I'm now going to show you how rhetoric separates itself from an argument, because rhetoric will always use fallacies, while a strong argument will try to avoid fallacies. So the question we have to ask ourselves then is, well, what exactly do we mean by fallacies? Oftentimes, in a ground class, I think students can be intimidated by fallacies. They can be a little nervous, scared, think they're boring. But fallacies can sometimes be really easy to identify. Some of them are silly, and some of them are just outright stupid. But I think it's important for us to be able to define a fallacy and then be able to identify them. So in a ground class, what I would do is I would write the word fallacy on the board, and I'd ask students to take a guess what they think the word fallacy means. Just by looking at the word or hearing what the word is, what do you think the term fallacy means? And generally what students will come up, they can look at the word fallacy, or you can hear the word fallacy, and the first thing that comes to mind is something that is false. So something that is fake. So I will define fallacies as false logic. And so I think it's important, if we accept my definition of rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people, and we go out into the real world and we come across someone and they're using a fallacy, we catch them saying something that is false or something that is fake, what happens is our brain starts to critically think, and fallacies are less likely to have an impact on us. So that's why I think it's important for us to identify fallacies. And if you look in our St. Martin's Handbook, they list, I think, somewhere between 15 and 18 different fallacies. And some of the fallacies are great, some of them are silly, and some of them are just dumb. So one of the fallacies that I always like is I like the ad hominem. And an ad hominem is when you attack a person's character rather than addressing the issue. So an ad hominem is attacking a person's character rather than dealing with the issue. So if you imagine that there is an imaginary student in our class, and he gets on to this video and he starts yelling and screaming and he says, "Hey, don't take Professor Gutowski's English class. Professor Gutowski is a jerk. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class. He's just like Hitler. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class. He's a real son of a bitch." Well, notice what that student did was he used an ad hominem, right? He attacked my character rather than addressing an issue. Notice he said, don't take Professor Gutowski's online class. He requires a lot of work. Don't take Professor Gutowski's online class because it's confusing and hard to understand. So rather than addressing an issue, that imaginary student attacked my character. The other fallacy I really like is I like the non sequitur. And the non sequitur is when you take two things that have nothing in common and you associate them together. So you take two things that have nothing in common and you try to associate them together. So imagine that same student comes on and says, "Hey, don't take Professor Gutowski's English class. He's just like Hitler. Don't take Professor Gutowski's English class. It's just like being at Auschwitz." Well, notice what that student did was he used a non sequitur, right? He compared our class to being in a concentration camp, or he compared me to Hitler, right? He associated two things that have nothing in common, because no matter how much you do not like our English class, it has nothing to do with a concentration camp. And the reason why I like these two fallacies so much is because I see them used all the time. We see them used in politics very much. Notice that when George W. Bush was president, they always used to say, "Don't vote for President Bush. He's just like he's just like Hitler. Don't vote for President Bush. He's clumsy, he's stupid, and he's from Texas." Notice that those issues those issues attack his character rather than addressing an issue. They don't deal with the fact that maybe Bush wants to cut taxes or that Bush wants to expand the military. Notice recently we've seen politicians who have compared getting a COVID vaccine shot to the Holocaust, and they had to come out and apologize because that's a fallacy, right? They're not the same things. So I like these fallacies because we see them all the time in the real world. The other fallacy I think that I kind of like is the bandwagon, because the bandwagon's really easy. Everyone else is doing it, why aren't you, right? Everyone else is taking Professor Gutowski's, why aren't you? So I like the bandwagon because it's one of the easier fallacies. So what I want you to do now is there's going to be a discussion board